Today's video is some of my favorite shabby chic and French country DIYs. I hope you enjoy them.
Hi there, welcome to the Schwowin's Nest. My name is Sandra, and I'm so glad you're here.
My second project is using this frame that I had already done a couple of times. Originally it was brown, and then I put these stencils on there. Didn't really like the look of that either, so it ended up just sitting in my craft stash until I could think of something better to do with it. And I think I have. So I'm just going to take some sandpaper and sand off a little bit of that black just so it covers much better with the next coat of paint. I know I always paint everything white, but for this project, I decided to get out my chiffon cream chalk paint from Rust-Oleum, and I forgot how much I love Rust-Oleum chalk paint. I've been using my DIY chalk paint for a really long time, but this just goes on so smoothly and has superior coverage. It's my all-time favorite type of chalk paint, and I think I'm just going to have to start using it more. I did one coat on this and I let a little bit of that distressing from before peek through. I found this newspaper printable online. I'll have it linked down in my description box. And what I did was take it just into my regular photo editing program, and I just changed the color of it from black and white to more of a sepia or an old-fashioned brownish black kind of look. I'm just taking my Dollar Tree scoring tool and scoring around the edge so I know exactly where to cut. Then I'll use my paper trimmer. To apply the paper to the frame, I'm just using a glue stick. I'm going to put a generous amount all over it. I find that when I'm using thin paper like tissue paper, the Mod Podge works good because I can usually get the wrinkles out. But when I'm using thicker paper like printer paper or wrapping paper, there's too many wrinkles with Mod Podge. So I just prefer to use a regular glue stick. I'm going to go ahead and use a piece of sandpaper, just a fine grit, and go around the edges to pull up some of that original brown from the frame. And this will just make it look even more distressed and vintage. I also decided to add a little bit more dimension to the corners where the joints of the frame are, and using sandpaper didn't work that great, so I'm using the scoring tool from the Dollar Tree to pull up some of the paint and show the brown underneath. I don't know about you guys, but even using my paper trimmer, I did cut a little bit too small in a couple of areas. So I decided to take a small piece of twine and just hot glue it all the way around the inside of the frame. And I think it gave it more of a rustic look, which I really liked.
I'm going to decorate the frame with some Solowood flowers. I've got some skinned ones, which have the brown, and then some skinless, which are just the off-white. You guys have seen me use Solowood flowers a lot. I love them, and I specifically love them for French country and shabby chic decor. I'm going a little gung-ho with the flowers right down in this one corner. Then I'm going to be adding just a little bit to some of the other corners, and then I'm going to finish it off with some lamb's ear.
For a final embellishment, I decided to take just a couple of strands of twine and wrap them around the top of the frame. I think that just tied in the twine that was already on the interior of the frame really nicely. You'll have to let me know what you think of those Sola wood flowers. I love them, and you'll see me using them lots more in my future videos.
To start off this first project, I'm going to be printing a design on tissue paper. I just use dollar store tissue paper, but I always make sure that the shiny side is facing down when I tape it onto a piece of printer paper. Now, some of you have mentioned that your printer paper gets stuck or it gets shredded because of the tissue paper on it. You could also try a piece of cardstock, which would be a little bit thicker. The other thing you could try is using some masking tape, which I find tends to help because it does make the paper itself a little bit thicker and a little bit easier for the printer to grab. On the sides of the tissue paper, I like to take the tape and fold it over like this. So it's got to be folded onto the back of the paper, and that just makes it even more secure. This is the design I'm going to use, and I have a link for it down in my description box. This is a little mini teapot that I'm going to use for this project. And to get rid of the shiny surface, I'm going to give it a really good coat of Rust-Oleum Clear Matte Finish. Once that dries, I'm going to use the color Sheepskin by Folk Art. This is a chalk paint, and I'm going to give everything a couple of really good coats, letting it dry really well in between. Another problem that some of you have asked me about is your inkjet printer running when you're printing it on the tissue paper. When you apply the Mod Podge, then it tends to run. What you can do is also use that same Rust-Oleum Clear Matte Finish. Give it a couple of sprays, let it dry for at least an hour, and then try it one more time. Most of the time, that Rust-Oleum will seal in the ink, and then you won't have any bleeding at all. I'm going to apply the tissue paper using Mod Podge, a thin amount just where I want the tissue paper to be, and then I'm going to place it on top. I cut this pattern into a diamond shape, and I'm just going to be putting 2 of those pieces on either side of the teapot. I'm not going to worry about the spout or the handle right now. Use a very light touch when you're pressing down with your paintbrush on top of the tissue paper. You don't want it to tear. I wanted this teapot to have a little bit of a French country look, so I did look online to see if I could find any inspiration, and this is what I came up with. I loved how the handle and the lid were painted a little differently, so I'm going to paint the knob and the handle and the spout and the bottom rim of my little teapot with this beautiful eucalyptus green color. I did a couple of coats of the green and made sure I got inside the spout. Once it was completely dry, I just sprayed it with a glossy finish sealer, and I think this turned out absolutely beautiful. I just love the pattern of it, and I hope you love it too.
If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet and you like what you see, I would love it if you could hit that red button.
For this next project, I decided to make a wreath using this wreath form. I had used it for a different project earlier on, and I'm just pulling out all of the greenery. That's why I love these grapevine wreaths. You don't have to actually glue anything in if you don't want to. I wanted to make a beautiful spring wreath, and this is my inspiration. It's a little bunny wreath that came from the Pottery Barn website. I'm not going to put the ears on mine, but I am going to be using the creamy whites and the pinks and a lot of the soft green florals for this project. I'm going to start out by putting the white rose in the center, and then I'm going to flank it with 2 of the pink ones, and then those are going to be flanked with 2 of the creamy ones again. And that's just going to start creating the base of the wreath. This time I do want these flowers to be permanent, so I'm using some hot glue on the bottom of each of the stems and then pushing it into the grapevine wreath so it's really secure. I'm also going to be using some of this greenery that I got from Michael's. I really love the frosted look of them. They're sort of like a lamb's ear. They're kind of dusty, I guess you would call them. And I just love that kind of a look. It just softens up the green. I love green and bright green for the summer, but for spring, I really love these softer colors. Next, I took this smaller rosebud and put that a little ways up on the wreath, and I'm going to make a little arrangement right here, and then I'll duplicate it on the other side. I'm going to use some of the same greenery. I'm going to use some cherry blossoms that you can see there on the really large rose. I've added some there, and I've also got a little bit of dogwood and some hydrangea blossoms that I'm going to create sort of a little arrangement within an arrangement. So here I have some pink petals that were used in a different project that I kept and saved because I'm a crafter. I save everything. And I'm going to use a little bit of hot glue and just pinch it together and then add additional petals. So this looks like a little rosebud as well. And this turns out really pretty. And this is the reason why I pulled out the white ones because I thought they were just a little too thick. In my opinion, these turned out really soft and delicate, and they just looked so much better. All you do is just pinch them and then layer them together so they're not all in the same spot. I'm going to continue to fill up the wreath. I'm going to do it a little bit more sparse as I reach towards the top of the wreath. I don't want it to be hugely full like the inspiration, but I do want it to be really soft and delicate and romantic. I really love how this one turned out, and I hope you like it too. I'm starting off this project with two of these wood planks from the Dollar Tree and one of these larger signs. I made a mark where I want to cut it so it's just about a half an inch longer on each side, and I'm just going to use my miter box to create those. Then, using another one of the planks, I cut down two half-inch strips that you can see here. And this wood is really easy to cut down. I just used my box cutter. Now I'm using wood glue to apply everything and add it all together. What I wanted to do was just create sort of a little slotted piece of wood that has a hole in the center, but not a really big hole. You'll see what I mean here in a second. I'm going to use some clamps to clamp everything together and let it dry for a good half an hour. I'm going to use wood glue then to glue the two pieces together. I'm going to give this two really good coats of white chalk paint. This is the Bear brand. I've got just a little bit left at the bottom of the container, so I'm going to use it up. I'm going to paint a grain sack stripe in the center of this sign. So I'm using this piece of masking tape as my spacer. I'm going to use one that's a little bit longer, and I'm going to make sure that it's nice and straight and that I've got it securely taped down. Then I'll put another piece underneath my spacer piece and then pull that piece off. I decided to fold the masking tape down over the sides and then paint that area as well. The color that I'm using is a little bit lighter than for the teapot. It's still sort of a sage green, but this was a color from Martha Stewart that I really didn't like. So I added some darker green and some gray and came up with this beautiful light sage color. I'm going to be applying it fairly thickly, but not too thick. I want to be able to see a little bit of the brush stroke and a little bit of that white paint peeking through. You don't have to wait for the paint to dry for this step. I am going to use my blow dryer just to give it a little bit of a heat source so it can dry a little bit quicker. Look at how beautiful that looks, although I did have a little bit of a schmutz there. The next piece of tape is going to cover up the white space in between the grain sack stripe. So I'm going to go ahead and place that down, and then I'll place another piece of tape about a quarter of an inch in space away from the first piece of tape here. And that will give me my line for the thin grain sack stripe. And I'll repeat this process on the other side. I'll paint the stripes green again, making sure that I have full coverage, but not having that much coverage that you don't see a little bit of that white texture coming through. And again, I'm just going to go around the sides too. I have a clear stamp that is a swallow, which is a type of bird. I think it's a swallow anyway. It looks like one. I'm going to just put some ink on it. This is black ink and it's just from the dollar store. You can use basically whatever you like when you're doing your own projects. And I'm going to make sure that it's inked up really well. And then I'm going to place it right in the center of this piece. I'm not really sure what to call it, if it's a vase or a wood sculpture. You'll have to help me out with what you think it should be called. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and put the bird down and holding it really nice and steady with one hand, then just pressing it down, making sure that all of the areas come into contact with this piece. To give this more of an old and vintage look, I'm taking my chip brush with a little bit of black paint and just very lightly distressing all over the piece. I'm going to go along the back as well as a little bit on the front.
I've been wanting to make a wagon wheel wreath for a really long time, and I know that Dollar Tree carries a wire form, but I wanted mine to be wood. So I'm using a 12-inch embroidery hoop, and I'm going to use both of the hoops for this one, and some of these 6-inch dowels from the Dollar Tree. Now I'm going to have to cut these down as well, and I thought I would give these dog nail trimmers a try. I've seen a few people say that these cut dowels, and because they're a rounded edge, it's really easy to do so. I didn't find it so easy. Maybe I'm doing it wrong, but I think these dowels are just a little too thick for that. So I did switch over to my side cutters to finish the job. I'm using just a tiny little dot of hot glue on the end of the dowel to attach it to the embroidery hoop. I don't want a whole lot of glue seeping out because I want to be staining this later, and the glue will of course not take the stain. Once I have them all together, I'm going to take this 4-inch wood round that I did pick up at the Dollar Tree in a pack of 3, I believe, and I'm going to just measure to make sure that I have it in the right spot. And then I'm going to use hot glue to glue all of this down really well. Once that glue has dried, I can flip it over and add this other smaller piece of wood round, also came from the Dollar Tree, and then I'm set to start staining. And I think so far my wagon wheel looks pretty cool. To stain the wagon wheel, I'm using dark walnuts gel stain, and I'm diluting it a little bit with water because I want it to be absorbed right into the wood of the dowels and the embroidery hoop. I'm using these leaves that came off of a bush from the Dollar Tree, and I'm going to just on the back side of them paint them with my burnt orange paint. Now this is a honey brown color that comes from Americana, and I think it's just the perfect color to mimic the underside of magnolia leaves. So each of these is going to get one good coat. Once those are dry, I'm going to now paint the front just with some hunter green acrylic paint. I do have a little bit of talc in here to make it more of a chalk paint, so I only need to do one coat. But you can see that with this color on the front and that orange color on the back, they're turning into magnolia leaves. True magnolia leaves have a bit of a shine on the top of them, so I am taking my matte Mod Podge and I'm going to give them a coat. And this is just going to shine them up just a little bit to make them look like they are real magnolia leaves. Now that everything is dry, it's time to assemble the magnolia flowers, the leaves, and some extra little greenery onto the wagon wheel. I think I'm going to be putting it all the way around the side, so that's going to hide the little metal part. And I'm taking the blossoms right off the stems so I can glue them right down to the dowels and to the embroidery hoop. I love these magnolias. I do get these from Michael's, but I always make sure to get them at their 40% off or their coupon price. You can see here the leaves that are sitting on the side, they have a little bit of a shine, so they do look like magnolia leaves. I'm going to continue adding some leaves and some additional other greenery, a few other blossoms, and then this project is complete. I recycle a lot of my past projects, and this is one that I did a couple of years ago. I like the blue on it. I'm going to continue with that theme, but I'm going to paint the base of it and the roof with this Parisian gray chalk paint from Folk Art Home Decor line. I've got this pretty blue scrapbook paper that I'm going to just use a glue stick and apply it to the sides and the front and back of the birdhouse. Of course, I'm going to need to remove the little peg that is for the bird's little perch so I can put this on flat, but I'm going to be using something else to replace the perch at the end anyway. Any of the excess, I'm just going to use my sharp craft knife just to trim it off. I don't want to do any sanding yet. I've got 4 of these giant wooden beads. They had already been painted white for a different project. I'm painting them with the same gray paint, and once they're dry, I'll glue them to the bottom of the birdhouse just to make it look like it's a bit of a riser. Since I'm sticking with a little bit of a blue theme here, I decided to take my sanding block and sand down a little bit of the gray paint to show some of the blue and take it all the way down to the original wood of the birdhouse too. Now that the beads are dry, I'm just using a generous amount of hot glue and putting them in each of the 4 corners of the base. I'm doing a little bit of a patchwork quilt kind of style for the roof. I'm taking different types of scrapbook paper that kind of work with the theme, some in gray, some in beige, and then there's a couple more other blue ones. And I'm just cutting different size pieces, and I'm going to use my glue stick to just put them right onto the house. I'm going to just butt up the pieces together and then sand off the excess on the side. Using the sanding block and a downward motion, I'm just going to get off all of the excess paper, and that will leave it with a nice clean edge, but also a little bit of a rustic edge. This is a key that I had in my stash, but it's not the right color, so I'm just giving it a quick coat of white spray paint. I'm using some of the mini solo wood flowers that I have in my stash, and I'm going to just decorate a couple of the corners and then add some of that Dusty Miller to give it a little bit more of a green pop. I want to say I am very sad to know that the Solo Wood Flowers company has decided to no longer ship internationally. Since I live in Canada, they consider that international, so I will no longer be able to purchase any of the Solo Wood flowers. I still have a link down in the description box for you, so feel free to continue to use that link if you're purchasing the Sola flowers. For this project, I'm redoing this wannabe lantern. It's made from 4 of the Dollar Tree frames, and I still have the glass inside of them. I'm using my Weldbond glue, which is my favorite permanent glue, and these tiny little wooden beads, and I'm going to cover the top with the beads all the way around. This glue has about a 5-minute working window until it starts to dry, so it's a perfect amount of time for me to get all of the beads across the top. Originally, when I built this so-called lantern, I had hot glued the glass panes back into it. So now I'm just pushing very gently and making sure that I don't break it, getting the hot glue to release from either the glass or from the frame. Now that the glass is out, it's going to be very easy to paint all of the nooks and crannies, and once it's dry, I'll be able to glue the glass right back in. I am going to be using hot glue in the corners to put the glass back in, but I decided to use a little bit of the Weldbond glue on the sides just to give it a little bit extra security. I wanted to create a riser or platform for the lantern slash cloche. So I needed something then to put these two pieces together. So I'm using these square dowels and I'm going to cut two the length of the sides and then two a little bit smaller for the other sides. That will be what I will be using then to hold all of this together. I'm just using my miter box and a hacksaw to cut through the dowels. I used hot glue to put all of the dowels in place, and once that was complete, I added 4 more of these really large wood beads, and then I painted everything white. Now I'm just distressing it with my chip brush with some dark gray paint just to give it a weathered and old look. I'll do the same for the lantern. Using some additional small wooden beads, I put them on a piece of wire that I got at the dollar store, and I painted them white as well. And now I'm going to use those as sort of the dome portion of the cloche. So I'm going to glue from corner to corner just using hot glue, and then I'll do the same on the other side, overlapping them and then gluing them all in place. I had to hold the beads in place for at least 2 minutes until the glue was completely set. Otherwise, it would just fall apart. But it's really secure and strong now that it's done, although I would never use the beads as a handle. The last thing I did was glue the two sets of beads together so they would be somewhat in the middle or as much in the middle as I can. And then it's time to dress it up. This year, for some reason, my local Dollarama store has been putting out these awesome wooden bunnies that stand up on their own. I've used a different one for another project, but I thought this one was absolutely cute. I'm going to remove all of his little accessories and then go around the outside edge of him with some candle wax. This is going to allow me to distress the outside of the bunny really easily without having to use sandpaper. I gave the rabbit 2 coats of my DIY chalk paint on the front and the back. And now I am just using a plastic scraper and I'm scraping off the paint where I had applied the wax. And you can see that it's getting a beautiful distressed finish without having to use sandpaper. I did apply some wax to the body of the rabbit, but I think just giving the 2 coats of paint didn't allow any of the wax to come through. So I'm just taking my Cricut spatula, probably not the best tool to use. You could use a screwdriver or any other sharp object that you have, and I'm just scraping off in some areas some of the paint to give him more of a distressed look. I am going to be covering this bunny with all sorts of different layers of tissue paper printables. This is a French script that I put together available on my website under the free printables tab. And I'm just going to cut it into pieces and then actually tear it up a little bit so I get my words sort of falling off the page, as you can see here where I'm placing him. I'm just going to be using some Mod Podge to apply it. And if you want a full tutorial on how I do my tissue paper printables, I'll leave that link for you down in my description box. Wherever there was some excess tissue paper, I decided to just fold it over onto the edges of the rabbit, and that just gives it more of a high-end look. So just taking some Mod Podge again and making sure that I just fold everything over and smooth it out with the brush. Usually I go on to Pixabay.com and that's where I find a lot of the free printables that I use in my designs, but I was not able to find some pretty eucalyptus. So I went on to a different site that I have access to. It's called Creative Fabrica. There are SVGs and vector graphics and fonts and different images and clip art, and there's tons and tons of things on there. I'm going to leave the link that I have for you down in my description box if you want to go and check it out. I'm adding the eucalyptus in the spots where I think it looks pleasing, and then I'm going to do the same thing with some little lilac flowers. Everything that I used today has been printed off on tissue paper. Once the Mod Podge had all dried, I'm taking a small piece of sandpaper and going over the edges that I had distressed originally to pull that paint off. I want to make sure that that distressing is still visible, and because I overlapped the tissue paper quite a few times in some spots, I'm just going to take that portion of the tissue paper off. I still have yet to master the messy bow. For some reason, I just cannot figure it out. There are some people out there who can make a beautiful messy bow. I have not been one of those people. But I think this green ribbon was a little too thick and too stiff, so I ended up taking it out and trying again, and then it worked much better. I glued the bow to the neck of the bunny, and now I'm just adding some of this reindeer moss to the bottom piece of wood. I just want to camouflage that a little bit, so I'm going to add it all the way around the front, the sides, and along the back. I wanted to add some florals, but I didn't want anything to overpower the pattern that's already on the bunny. So I'm taking some of these little baby's breath from the Dollar Tree and I'm trimming them down really nice and short, just going along the front a little bit in some groupings just to give that reindeer moss a little bit more of a pop. I love how this bunny turned out. For this spring French country DIY, I grabbed this scrap piece of wood from my garage and I'm just taking my sanding block and rounding out the edges so it's not quite so sharp. I gave it 2 coats of my DIY chalk paint, and now I'm taking the same sanding block, going all the way around the edges, making sure that I get all the way down to the bare wood, a little bit extra around the corners. I just want this to look really old and weathered. I'm going to add some scrapbook paper to the bottom of the board, and I'm just taking the scrapbook paper and tearing it up so I get a nice rough edge on it. I don't want to have anything too straight on this. Again, I want it to look really old and weathered, so I'm just going to keep trimming the paper down by tearing it until I get the size I need. I'm just going to use a glue stick to apply it to the wood. I'm going to start at the top and then just smooth it out. And then I have another little piece of paper that's going to fill in the bottom section. And you can see here around the edges that it's exactly how I wanted it. I want it to look kind of off a little bit and not perfect. Next, I'm taking a tiny little piece of sandpaper and running it along the edge of the paper to give it a little bit even more distressing. This is going to pull up some of the paper and actually get it right off. And it's also just going to kind of fade out the print on the paper and make it look like it's really worn. I love using drop cloth in my projects, and I'm still working on a piece that I picked up at Home Depot for 20 bucks. It was 4 feet wide by 15 feet long, and I swear, I think I've had it for 2 years and I've just been working at it until I get rid of it. I'm almost done, so soon it'll be time for a new piece. I'm just going to cut this again a little smaller than the scrapbook paper because I want you to be able to see all of these details. I am using fabric scissors. You can see how easily they glide through the fabric. So if you are cutting any fabric, make sure you have a good pair of scissors. Otherwise, you're going to be struggling and you're probably going to wreck the fabric too. I frayed the edges of the fabric just by pulling on the threads and getting some of them out. It never turns out even, so don't be afraid to just trim your little frayed edges and make them look better. Okay, so you've seen me do all sorts of dupes of the IOD stamps and transfers. And I did say that they were pretty expensive and over my budget, but you know what? I decided to invest in the sprig stamps. They are my absolute favorite, and this is the first time I'm using them. So I'm just gently pulling off the cover sheet, and then I'm going to be cutting out the one that I want from the bottom sheet. I'm going to leave all of the stamps on the thick plastic that they're on here that you can see, and I'm going to be using that as my backing. So I really love this one in the center that looks like a lavender. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that out, and then I'm going to do a test run on a piece of paper. For now, the ink I'm using is just from the dollar store, but I have a shipment of Stays On black ink on the way, and I'm hopeful that it will be here soon because I don't want to use this ink too much on my stamps. I want to use a good quality ink with them. Now I'm just going to lay it down, hold it in place, and then gently start pushing all of the leaves and everything down into place so I don't wiggle it. And when I lifted this up, I just about jumped out of my skin. It's absolutely gorgeous. Take a look at that. Oh my gosh, it's absolutely beautiful. I am so in love. I cleaned off the stamp and now I'm reapplying the ink to put it on my little piece of drop cloth. I think if I had better ink, it would have turned out a little bit deeper, or maybe I just didn't add enough ink to my stamp, but I still really like how it turned out. I just used hot glue to apply it to the plank, and then I added a couple of little shoestring bows. And even though the flower looks a little bit faded, I still think it looks absolutely beautiful. I'm going to use two of these Dollar Tree houses and make them look like faux wood blocks, like they would be solid. The way I'm going to do that is just trace out a thin piece of cardboard and glue that onto the front of the box to make it look solid. I'm going to glue the cardboard on using my Weldbond glue. This is the best glue ever. It sticks to anything. And I wanted this to be nice and flat, so that's why I didn't want to use hot glue. Sometimes the hot glue will make it raised up a little bit, and I didn't want to have any gaps. So I'm just going to lay this down, press it down really well, and then give it about 10 minutes to set up with something heavy on top of it. Using my mushroom paint color, I'm going to paint the back of the houses, which is actually the front, so the piece of cardboard, and I'm just going to give it one good coat. I want this to kind of blend in to the whole look of these houses. I put together these really pretty French labels. I'm going to cover the whole front of the house with it, just with a glue stick. Then I'm going to take my sandpaper and sand off the edges, putting a little bit more effort onto the paper itself so that can get worn and weathered off a little bit too. Then I used a finer grit sandpaper and went over more on the inside of the paper just to kind of sand it down a little bit more and then give that little bit of grain sack stripes at the top and the bottom a worn and weathered look too. I'm taking a baby wipe with a little bit of my walnut gel stain and I'm just going to wipe it very gently along the edges. It's going to darken up the paper, make it look a little bit more vintage with sort of a sepia kind of color. And then I decided that I would stain the sides of the houses as well, just to make it look a little bit more blended in. I'm really getting into the French country farmhouse look, and I love how these signs turned out.
This first project was so much fun. I just had my creative juices flowing, and I thought it was just a really neat way to upcycle some terracotta pots that I had painted previously. I've got two of them, and they're both going to get a couple of coats of white chalk paint. I'm taking a small piece of DOS clay. I get this at Michael's, and I'm just working it in my hand so it gets nice and soft and malleable. What I'm going to do is just squish it down into sort of a circle or an oval shape. And I'm using this old roller that I had from the Pampered Chef. I've got a couple of them, so this was perfect to just help me roll out this medallion into a nice even piece. Now, if you're a crafter like me, you probably have an arsenal of different things in your stash, but I'm going to be using these rubber stamps. I bought a set of 4 of them at Michael's, I think for $3.99, and they still have this set there, and I thought it was just so pretty. What I'm going to do is just literally push in my rubber stamps and create a beautiful design for this medallion. I did push a little hard because I wanted a really nice indent on it, and I did get a little bit of the circle of the wood, but the clay is really forgiving. You just run your finger around it really gently and you can smooth that out. You can create any design you want. I'm just going to fill this with all sorts of different shapes with these florals and some leaves. And I'm going to actually let some of them hang off the edge as well. And I think this turned out really pretty. Here's a look at how it turned out. You can see how I took some of the stamps right off the edge of the clay. Next, I'm just going to smooth out the edges of the clay. There were a few kind of ridges and bumps. I didn't want it to be a perfect circle, but I wanted it to be a little smoother. I'm going to use this round one for on the larger pot, and I'm just kind of turning it to see where I want it to set. I wanted it to end up going sort of on a longer oval, so I'm just kind of pushing down that top portion a little bit just to get it the right shape. I'm going to use some tacky glue to hold this in place, and I'll also use some masking tape to make sure it doesn't slide around. I like to spread the glue around with my fingers to make sure I can get it all the way out to the edge. For this second smaller pot, I wanted to make sort of an trim accent around the rim of the pot. So I'm just creating a snake out of my clay, and I'm just going to make sure that I have enough length to go around the pot rim once. Then I'm going to use my hands to flatten it down a little bit, and I also use the rolling pin just very gently to flatten it out even a little bit more, make it about an inch wide. To create the design on this one, I'm using this sunflower rubber stamp, and I'm pushing fairly hard into the clay. I want this to have some really good details. And this is the perfect stamp to use because you can see all of the little nooks and crannies where the leaves are or the petals are of the sunflower. And I'm just going to keep going all the way across and create this beautiful trim mold. I'm going to use the tacky glue once again. You can use whatever permanent glue you have. You could use E6000, you could use wood glue, you could also use more of a all-purpose sort of strong carpenter glue, whatever you have on hand. You could even use a super glue. This was a little tricky trying to get this on there without having to actually break it. So what I'm doing here is just very gently pushing the clay onto where the glue is, and then I've got to kind of get the rest of it out of the way so I can add a little bit more glue. Now, if I would be doing this again, and what I can tell you to do is put the glue on your rim all the way around. Do that first, and then you can just go ahead and lay your clay down and make sure that it's in the right spot without having to fuss with the glue every time like I'm doing here. I didn't break my clay, but a couple of times I thought it was going to happen. Once I got all the way around, I used my Cricut spatula just to cut the clay, and then I joined it together. I did cut it a little short, but I was able to kind of just very gently push the clay together so I could get rid of the gap. Once the clay was completely dry, I believe I left them overnight. I don't think you have to do it overnight. You want them to be almost dry before you paint them or do anything with them, but because I was using the glue that kind of made it slide around, I decided to just let it dry overnight. Now I'm going over all of the clay areas with just a one coat of white chalk paint just to make them look the same color. It's so pretty just the way it is. I just love how these turned out. Now that everything is dry, I'm taking some of this Parisian gray chalk paint. It's just a light gray and a chip brush that is really rough. I wanted to have a lot of texture on this, and I wanted to be able to actually really have to push with my brush to get some of the marks on. I didn't want to distress it completely all the way around. I wanted to have some darker spots, some lighter spots, and really make this look old and aged. Next, I'm going to be adding another color. This is called Mushroom. It's very similar to the mineral color, I think, in the Waverly chalk paint. And this is a softer chip brush. And you can see that I'm getting a little bit more marking on here because it is softer. So it allows me to add a little bit more paint as well. I wanted this to have a really nice two-tone effect. Once I had the distressing the way I wanted it to, I took the rough chip brush again and just started making little areas like this at the bottom, at the top, just so it would look like the paint has chipped off and worn even more than in the other areas. So you can do this or you cannot do this. It's totally up to you. But I just thought it would look really neat having some areas that were a little bit more distressed than the regular portion. The taller pot had the medallion on the bottom, but this one looked a little plain next to that one. So I decided to take this script stamp that I have and I pushed it down, but I didn't push all of it down. You're going to see here in a second that it just came off on some of the areas, and the majority of it in the center was not there. And that's exactly what I was looking for. I wanted it to be sort of worn away. And now I'm going to take the rest of the ink that's on this and just kind of haphazardly go all over the pot and just push it down in different areas so it looks like this print was just kind of scattered on the pot. Then I added some greenery, some ribbons, a shabby chic bow or two, and I think these turned out absolutely shabby chic and a little bit farmhouse too. Let me know what you think. For my projects today, because this is shabby chic meets farmhouse, I wanted to use some classic farmhouse decor pieces. A mason jar is definitely something that you see in farmhouse decor, a lot of it, but I want to make this one shabby chic. So I'm taking this wide lace ribbon and I'm going to glue it around the bottom of the jar, and then I'm going to add another layer on the top of the jar. And that's just going to create a really beautiful ambiance for what I'm going to be doing with this later. I'm just using tiny little dots of hot glue and that will hold it in place perfectly. Once I had the lace all done, I took a piece of masking tape and just applied it where the top of the lace was. Now I'm giving this small little section a couple of coats of white chalk paint. You don't have to do this part, but I just thought it would make it look a little bit different. I wanted it to be not your typical mason jar decor piece. When I remove the tape, I'm left with this clear band. I'm going to add some burlap ribbon. You don't have to do this, but I thought it framed all the lace and the white out really pretty. I am definitely not a pink girl, but I'm starting to lean towards some of the softer shades like this ribbon. It's beautiful satin and it has a pretty cherry blossom design on it. And I thought it would be perfect just to round out this project. Using the same ribbon, I created a double loop bow. I'm just going to glue that off center a little bit. I'm always an off center person. Gluing things in the center just doesn't do it for me. Anyway, I'm going to fix these tails so they sit really nicely. And then I'm going to add some solo wood flowers to the one side. And I really love how this one turned out. It was so plain to start with, and it is just a beautiful piece of shabby chic farmhouse decor now. And you can use this to add some more florals to the top of it if you like. You can add some fresh greenery in here. You can also just maybe use it as a utensil jar or a makeup brush holder. You could also put some candles in it and make it shine. I really love this piece, and I hope you like it too. If a windmill doesn't scream farmhouse, then I don't know what does. I'm going to just use the blades on this and not use any of the poles. To cover all of those bright colors, I gave it 3 coats of white chalk paint, and then I printed off some designs on tissue paper that I am now going to decoupage onto the different blades. So I've got some larger pieces and some smaller pieces, and I'm going to just kind of put them all over the place, not in any particular pattern. I'm just going to make sure that each blade has some type of decoupage on it. I'll have this printable available on my website. All you have to do is click the link down in my description box. If you don't already have an account, sign up for a free account and then log in, and you'll be able to download as many as you like. I'm using Mod Podge to apply the tissue paper onto the blades and then just very gently putting some Mod Podge on top to make sure that it stays down. And then I'll just set it aside to dry. For all the little excess tissue paper that was hanging off the edges, I'm just taking an emery board and gently filing everything off. Here you can see all of the designs that I have. Now I'm taking the same Parisian gray that I used for the pots and this smaller little chip brush. It's just easier to get into all of the little nooks and crannies with a smaller brush. And I'm going to dry brush it fairly heavily. I want to have some really good distressing on this. I want the decoupage pieces to also have a little bit of gray paint on them. And I'm kind of accenting the edges of the blades too. On one of the blades, I had accidentally put too much paint on the corner, but then I really thought that that looked amazing. So I went with my brush and just kind of added a little bit of extra paint to each corner of the blade, and that just made it look even more weathered and distressed. I'm using a lace ribbon, which I tied into a bow, and now I'm going to add some lavender underneath it. And I tried making this bow off center, but it just didn't look right. So this is one of the rare times that I put things in the center. I'm going to add some of these larger lavender pieces, and then I'm going to add a little bit of greenery, some smaller little lavender pieces, and for a final touch, I'll add some of that lavender satin ribbon you can see up in the right-hand corner. I'm going to add a few longer tails and add some beads at the bottom of the tails. And I think this one turned out really pretty too.
For this project, I'm using a wooden charger plate that I picked up at the thrift store. I'm going to give it one good coat of my DIY chalk paint, and I'm using a chip brush because I want a lot of brush strokes in this paint technique. I'm also going in the same direction. You can see that I'm just going up and down consistently because I want this to have sort of a wood grain feel. Next, I'm going to attach these extra large wooden beads as feet, so this can be a decorative wall piece, but also a tray. I'm gluing these together so there's raw wood on raw wood, which means the glue will hold much better. Once this has dried, I'm also going to give the complete bottom along with the beads a coat of my white chalk paint. I want to give this plate a shiplap look, so I'm just using my ruler and a pencil, and I'm going to just draw 3 lines. I've already measured them out and put a little dot so I know where to go with my lines. I wanted the shiplap lines to be a little bit distressed, so I'm just using my finger and smudging that pencil all the way across. This really made a big difference in how the piece looks. The technique I'm using today requires me to add water to the projects. So in order for my chalk paint not to bleed or run or come off with the water, I'm giving it a good coat of Rust-Oleum clear matte finish. The process I'm using today is water slide decal paper. I get mine from Hippo, and I do have a link for it down in my description box. It is a really inexpensive way to achieve an IOD stamp or transfer look without having to spend all that money on those transfers. I used my detail scissors to cut out the design fairly close to all of the leaves, but I didn't want to go too detailed because then it's really difficult to hang on to the product when you're trying to get it on your project. With water slide paper, the next step is to immerse it completely in some really nicely warm water. You don't want it hot, but you don't want it too cool. And you need to press everything down. So you can see all of the little edges that I cut out are curling up. And that's why I didn't want to go too detailed with my cutting, because I still need to be able to push all of this down into the water. You're going to leave it here for a good 35, 40 to 60 seconds. Once you see that the plastic is starting to lift off from the paper, you're ready to pull it out. When I'm working with larger projects like this, I like to use a spray bottle to mist my item. It just makes it easier to make sure that there's enough water underneath the water slide paper so you don't have a hard time getting it stuck down. So what you do then is just pull off the paper from underneath. Make sure that your design is attached to some part of your project at the top, and then gently pull out the paper from underneath. Take your time with this because it can wrinkle, but you have some time to move it and get it nice and straight. That's why you want a decent amount of water underneath your project so you can lift it off and then press it down where it needs to be. Then take a soft cloth or a tissue. I like to use a tissue and gently press from the inside out, making sure that you're pushing all of those water bubbles out to the edge. And the reason you're using either a paper towel or a tissue is that once that water gets to the edge, it gets absorbed by the tissue, and then you're not left with a water puddle mess. Next, I'm going to freehand the word gather on it. I am looking at a paper above there that has the word that I want and the font style, so I can just duplicate that down on my tray. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to take my Sharpie oil-based marker and fill it in. I'm giving it one coat of matte Mod Podge so I can make sure that that transfer is permanent. And I am absolutely in love with this project. If you're interested in a full tutorial on how to use water slide decal paper, I will list that in my description box and on the end screen of this video. One thing to note, you do need to use a matte clear spray on your decals, otherwise they turn out shiny. The can I grabbed at the store the last time was a semi-gloss, which is a huge no-no. That's why you can see all of the shine on these projects, but I still think they turned out absolutely beautiful. This first one is with 3 of these thrifted frames that I found for $1.99. They were part of my last haul. I just thought the lines and the details were absolutely beautiful. So what I'm going to do first is paint all 3 of them with a couple coats of my DIY chalk paint. If you're interested in learning how to make that chalk paint, I have a recipe down in my description box. I thought about a few different ways to distress this. I could use some dark wax or I could use some sandpaper, but I decided just to take my Cricut spatula here. You could use any type of metal scraping tool and just go ahead and scrape the paint off where I wanted the original gold and dark brown to show through. I learned this technique from Jamie over at Simple Roots Simple Living, and she uses a paint scraper. It's a really fun tool. I've never seen it before, and I think I'm probably going to get myself one because she uses it on wood as well, and that just gives it a really chippy look. So if you're not familiar with Jamie over at Simple Roots Simple Living, I'm going to have her channel linked down in my description box. Using my computer and the Google Drawing program and Pixabay for free images, I created some printables that I'm going to print off on white cardstock and then just use a glue stick to glue them onto the original backing of the frame. I create a lot of my free printables in Google Drawing, so if you're interested in learning how to use that program, I just launched a tutorial a couple of days ago and I'll have it linked down in my description box. I printed these out on white cardstock, and I love using my paper trimmer just to make sure that I get a nice straight line. Sometimes when I'm using my scissors, I get a little wonky, so having this type of tool is really handy when you're doing paper crafts. Once I have the glue applied and my paper stuck on the backing, I'm just going to tack it into the frame with a few dots of hot glue in the 4 corners, and then I'm going to use a generous amount of hot glue all the way around the backing to make sure that it's securely into the frame. When I use hot glue, I like to make sure that I hold it down a little bit because I want this cardboard to adhere to the sides of the frame. And with applying a whole bunch of hot glue, sometimes it's best just to hold it down and wait for that glue to set a bit and then move on to the next part. I had 3 of these frames, so I did a different flower for each frame, and I put the labels of 2 of the flowers inside using just a Sharpie fine tip marker, and I just hand wrote it in. But you'll have to let me know if you know what the 3rd flower is because I couldn't find anything similar to it online. So if you know what it is, let me know because I'd love to be able to make this a matching set.
Thanks so much for spending some of your time with me today. I really appreciate each and every one of you. I hope you enjoy your Easter weekend with friends and family, and I'll see you in the next one.